Miss Marple and the Poisoned Christmas Pudding Chapter 1. The Christmas gathering. The drawing room of Thornfield Manor glowed with the amber warmth of firelight, and Mrs. Eleanor Ashworth stood at the window, watching snowflakes spiral lazily past the leaded glass. Behind her, the tree sparkled with decades of accumulated ornaments, some silver, some tarnished, all of them laden with the weight of family tradition. It was Christmas Eve, and the house was full. Not pleasantly full, Eleanor thought, adjusting a strand of silver hair that had escaped her careful arrangement. Rather, it was the sort of full that made one acutely aware of every awkward silence, every forced laugh, every unspoken grievance simmering beneath the surface of holiday civility. "My dear Eleanor, you're looking positively grim," came a voice from the doorway. Miss Jane Marple, 73, and still possessed of those peculiar pale blue eyes that seemed to see through to a person's very soul, entered the room with her customary quiet grace. She wore a grey cardigan and carried her knitting some innocuous grey scarf that she'd been working on for the better part of a week without visible progress. Eleanor turned, attempting a smile. I was simply admiring the snow. You know how rare a white Christmas has become." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, settling into a wingback chair with the deliberate precision of someone accustomed to her own creaking joints. "The last proper snow I recall was in 1947, though the winters of my girlhood were far more severe. The village children would skate on the pond for weeks on end. Of course, there was the Thornton boy who drowned in that very ice in 1892, a tragedy brought on by his mother's neglect, though she was never blamed for it. These things have a way of repeating themselves, don't you find?" Eleanor stiffened almost imperceptibly. It was exactly the sort of rambling observation that had endeared Miss Marple to so many people over the decades. That quality of seemingly wandering off into innocent reminiscence. And yet, Eleanor had learned long ago never to be entirely certain what Miss Marple meant when she spoke. The afternoon had been marked by the arrival of Eleanor's family. Her son, Richard, a banker in London, had come with his wife Catherine, a woman 15 years his junior with the sort of beauty that seemed to require constant reassurance. Their twin children, Emma and Thomas, aged 17, had already discovered the brandy in the library and were being conspicuously loud about their university prospects. Eleanor's daughter, Margaret, had arrived separately, divorce finalized just 6 months ago, which she wore like a scarlet letter, despite everyone's best attempts at discretion. And then there was Robert Ashworth, Eleanor's brother-in-law, a veterinarian who had always lived too comfortably in the margins of the family, never quite belonging, but never quite leaving either. It was Robert who had insisted that Miss Marple be invited. "She's been alone at her cottage for years," he'd said, with that persuasive charm that had always made Eleanor suspicious. "The least we can do is ensure she's not spending Christmas in solitude." Eleanor had agreed, of course, because one did not refuse such requests without appearing ungracious. Miss Marple was a saint in the villagers' estimation, the sort of elderly woman who appeared at every christening, every funeral, every crisis with the same composure and genuine kindness. But Eleanor had lived too long not to recognize that kindness, however genuine, could still serve as a most effective mask. "I was thinking of the pudding," Eleanor said, returning to the practical matters that had been occupying her morning. "It's been made for 3 weeks now, as tradition dictates. The Christmas pudding is always the centerpiece of our Christmas dinner." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. "Your mother's recipe, I assume?" "My grandmother's, actually. It's terribly rich, 2 pounds of fruit, eggs, spices, and the brandy." Mother made it faithfully every year, and have never altered it. Some things oughtn't be changed. How very wise, Miss Marple murmured. Though I've always found that traditions, while comforting, can sometimes harbor the most dangerous assumptions. People tend to believe that because something has always been done a certain way, it must continue to be done precisely that way. They stop paying attention. They become predictable. Eleanor felt a peculiar chill despite the warmth of the fire. She set down her teacup with perhaps more force than necessary. The pudding is kept in the pantry, locked away. I take no risks with such things. Not anymore. There was a moment of silence, just a breath. Really, but it stretched into something longer and more significant. Miss Marple's needles continued their rhythmic click-click-click. Yet her pale eyes had a quality of sudden, sharp attention. It was Margaret who interrupted, bursting into the room with the affected cheerfulness that had become her armor since the divorce. Mother, Aunt Catherine wants to know about the wine for dinner, and Richard is being impossible about the seating arrangements. He insists that Thomas should sit at the main table with the adults, but Emma's feelings will be hurt. And oh, Miss Marple, how lovely to see you. Do tell me you've been well. The younger woman bent to kiss Miss Marple's cheek with genuine affection, and Eleanor watched as the old woman's expression softened into something almost maternal. This was the gift of Miss Marple's nature, that ability to make everyone feel, in her presence, that they were the most important person in the world. It was a gift Eleanor had never quite managed to cultivate, even after all these years of trying. I've been perfectly well, dear, Miss Marple assured her. Though I confess these large family gatherings do occasionally remind me of why I've chosen to live alone. But that's the privilege of age. One is permitted eccentricity that would be judged harshly in the young. Eleanor was struck, as she often was, by the duality of Miss Marple's words, the surface meaning, pleasant and amusing, yet something deeper lurking beneath, something that suggested an understanding of life's darker currents that went far beyond the pale blue eyes and the knitting needles. We're dining at 7, Eleanor said to Margaret. The pudding will be served for dessert, as always. Please tell Richard that the seating arrangement is final. Both twins at the children's table. Some traditions exist for a reason. She did not add that she preferred her family in smaller, more manageable configurations. She did not add that there was something about having them all assembled beneath one roof that made her feel as though she was sitting atop a powder keg. Waiting for the spark, Miss Marple picked up her teacup and took a delicate sip. I do hope the pudding is memorable, she said softly. The most important meals always are. Eleanor felt that peculiar chill again, deeper this time, settling somewhere in the vicinity of her heart. Neither woman could have known. As the snow continued to fall outside Thornfield Manor, and the family moved through their evening preparations with the unconscious rhythms of ritual, that before Christmas dinner was finished, someone in that house would be dead, and that the instrument of their death would be the very pudding that had been made 3 weeks before, wrapped in cloth, soaked in brandy, and locked safely away. Neither woman could have known that by tomorrow evening the police would be at the door, and the peaceful village of Thornford would be consumed by the dark fascination that only a murder among the respectable classes could inspire. But Miss Marple, stirring her tea with measured precision, suspected something, and as she had learned over a lifetime of careful observation, suspicion, however vague, was often the first cousin to truth. Chapter 2. The Christmas dinner. The dining room of Thornfield Manor blazed with candlelight. The long mahogany table extended to its fullest capacity, held the silver of 3 generations and the crystal that Eleanor had inherited from her mother. The turkey had been carved with ceremonial precision, the vegetables arranged in their proper dishes, and now, as the clock approached 9 o'clock, Mrs. Eleanor Ashworth rose to ring the small brass bell that would summon cook to bring out the pudding. It was a moment of tradition, so ingrained in the family's consciousness that no one gave it particular thought. The twins were already anticipating the flaming spectacle, the pudding carried in a light with brandy, casting dancing shadows across the faces of those gathered. Richard was already loosening his waistcoat slightly and complaining good-naturedly about the richness of the meal. Catherine was mid-conversation with Miss Marple about the merits of country life versus London sophistication, a discussion that Miss Marple was navigating with her characteristic ability to make the other person feel simultaneously heard and gently corrected. Robert sat at Eleanor's right hand, as he had for every Christmas for the past 30 years. His weathered face was flushed from the wine, and he'd been quieter than usual throughout the meal, but then Robert was often quiet in ways that no one seemed to notice or question. Margaret sat across from her uncle, her fork moving mechanically through her food, her eyes distant in that way they'd been since the divorce papers were signed. "The pudding," Eleanor announced, and the family brightened in unison, as though responding to a cue in a well-rehearsed play. Cook appeared moments later, the pudding ceremoniously presented on the good china, the ancient recipe brought forth, as it had been every Christmas for 4 decades. The brandy was poured, the match struck, and the pudding was set aflame. It was beautiful in that traditional way that English Christmas is meant to be beautiful. Warm, bright, surrounded by family, steeped in the comfort of ritual. Eleanor began to serve, careful to distribute equal portions to each plate. She always served herself last, a habit so automatic that no one had ever commented upon it. The pudding was rich and dark, studded with dried fruit and spices, the familiar scent of cinnamon and nutmeg rising with the warmth. Richard took a generous spoonful immediately, pronouncing it excellent as he always did. Thomas and Emma picked at theirs, the Christmas pudding being one of those foods that children were expected to enjoy but rarely did without complaint. Catherine ate with delicate precision, as she did everything. Margaret accepted her plate and set it before her, but made no move to taste it. It was Miss Marple who first noticed something amiss. She had taken a single, careful spoonful. Miss Marple was the sort of woman who ate slowly and deliberately, extracting maximum enjoyment from minimum consumption. She held the spoon halfway to her mouth and then, with a subtle pause, lowered it back to her plate. Her pale blue eyes flickered across the table, and Eleanor caught that familiar quality of sudden attention, though the old woman's expression remained serene. But Eleanor had no time to wonder at Miss Marple's hesitation, because Richard suddenly set down his fork with a sharp clatter. "Good Lord," he said, reaching for his water glass. "What on earth is in this pudding?" "It tastes rather," he paused, confusion crossing his features. "Rather bitter, and there's a peculiar aftertaste, almost metallic." Metallic. Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. "Richard, that's not possible. The pudding is made precisely as it always has been." "Well, something's wrong with it," Richard said, draining half his water in one gulp. He pushed his plate away with visible distaste. "I don't know what, but I'm not eating another bite." "Catherine, don't touch yours. There's something definitely off." Catherine, who had been raising her spoon to her lips, set it down obediently. What could possibly be wrong with it? "Eleanor, didn't you make it yourself?" "Of course I did," Eleanor said, her voice remaining level, though a peculiar coldness was creeping through her veins. It's the same recipe I've always used. The same ingredients. I keep them locked." She stopped abruptly, realizing what she'd been about to say, aware that Miss Marple's attention had sharpened further, though the old woman continued to regard her untouched pudding with an air of innocent contemplation. "Well, I'm going to try mine," Robert announced, his words slightly slurred from the wine. "Can't let good food go to waste. If there's something wrong, one plate spoiled is enough." He took a generous spoonful, and Eleanor watched, horror blooming across her face, as he swallowed. For a moment, nothing happened. Robert smiled vaguely at the table, took another spoonful, and then his expression began to shift. His smile faltered. He set down his spoon with deliberate care, as though he needed to concentrate on even this simple action. He began, then stopped. His hand went to his throat. "Eleanor, I don't feel." He rose from his chair, swaying slightly, knocking his wine glass over. The red liquid spread across the white tablecloth like blood, and Margaret gasped, rising as well. Uncle Robert. His face had gone very pale, almost grey beneath the flush of dinner. He opened his mouth as though to speak, and then his hand went to his chest, clutching at the fabric of his waistcoat. "Call the doctor," Eleanor heard herself say, moving toward him, though her movements felt strangely detached from the panic now flooding through her. Someone call for the doctor immediately. Thomas scrambled for the telephone in the hall. Catherine sat frozen, her hand over her mouth. Emma had gone white, tears already forming. Richard was on his feet now, his earlier annoyance replaced by genuine alarm. But it was Robert who held everyone's attention, who was now struggling to remain upright, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He reached out as though to steady himself on the table, and Eleanor caught him, shocked at how light he suddenly felt, how fragile. "Robert," she whispered, "hold on, the doctor is coming." His eyes met hers for just a moment, and in that moment, Eleanor saw something she hadn't expected. Not fear, but a strange sort of resignation, as though some part of him had been anticipating this moment for a very long time. Then he collapsed. The fall was not dramatic. There were no final gasping words, no theatrical last moments. Robert simply fell, his body striking the oriental rug beside the table with a heavy, final sound. Eleanor was on her knees beside him, loosening his collar, calling his name with increasing desperation. But even as she did, even as Richard was making useless attempts at some form of revival, even as the household descended into chaos and confusion, Eleanor knew with a terrible certainty that Robert Ashworth was already dead, and somewhere in the confusion and terror and rising hysteria, Miss Marple rose from her chair with measured composure, walked to the window, and gazed out at the snow still falling in the darkness beyond. Her expression was grave and thoughtful, and if one had been close enough to see her lips, one might have noticed that they had formed a single whispered word, yes. The Christmas pudding sat half-served, slowly congealing on its fine china plates. A Christmas pudding that tasted of brandy and spice and, apparently, of something far more sinister. A pudding that Eleanor had made with her own hands and kept locked away where she had insisted no one could tamper with it. A pudding that had been meant, perhaps, for an entirely different guest. And now, in the snowbound house at Thornfield Manor, a man was dead and the police were on their way. And the terrible machinery of murder investigation was about to transform this house of tradition and secrets into something far darker than anyone had anticipated. Chapter 3. The police arrive. Inspector William Hartley was a man of 45, who had learned, over 2 decades of police work, that the most dangerous crimes were always those committed within the genteel confines of the English middle class. Murder among the poor was straightforward desperation, rage, a bottle of cheap whiskey, and a knife. But murder among people with educations and property and family histories stretching back generations was an altogether different proposition. It required patience, psychological insight, and an almost surgical ability to separate fact from the elaborate fictions that the respectable told themselves. He stood now in the drawing room of Thornfield Manor, surveying the assembled family with the sort of neutral expression that gave nothing away. The body had been taken to the morgue in town. The preliminary examination suggested poison, the taste in the mouth, the sudden collapse. The metallic note that Richard had detected before deciding his discomfort was more important than his uncle's life. Hartley made a mental note. Richard Ashworth was the sort of man who would always prioritize his own convenience. "I understand," Hartley said, consulting his notebook with deliberate slowness, "that Mr. Robert Ashworth was a regular visitor to this house." "He was family," Eleanor said. Her hands were folded in her lap, her posture perfect, her voice steady. But Hartley had noticed that her fingers were trembling slightly, and she'd corrected herself 3 times when giving him basic biographical information. He lived in the village. He was a veterinarian. He'd spent Christmas here for 30 years. And was there any particular reason he would have been a guest tonight? Any special circumstance? "It's Christmas Eve," Catherine offered from the sofa, where she sat pressed against Richard's side like a frightened bird. "Everyone spends Christmas with family." Hartley turned his attention to her. "Yet Mr. Ashworth wasn't technically family, was he? He was your husband's uncle by marriage, which makes him a rather distant relation, but a dear friend," Margaret said quietly. She sat apart from the others, her back very straight, her eyes fixed on some point beyond the room. "Uncle Robert was kind. He was always kind enough to warrant poisoning," Hartley asked conversationally. "That's an interesting observation. Most people don't think of poisoning as a particularly kind gesture." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Hartley watched as Richard shifted uncomfortably, as Catherine's fingers dug into his arm, as Eleanor's jaw tightened. It was Miss Marple who spoke, her voice gentle and almost conversational. "Inspector, I wonder if you might allow me to offer a small observation." Hartley turned to look at the elderly woman with interest. He'd been aware of her presence all evening, the pale eyes that seemed to miss nothing, the way she had quietly declined to eat the pudding before refusing the meal entirely. "Of course, Madame. I understand you were present during the incident." "I was, indeed," Miss Marple said, setting aside her knitting with careful precision. "And I have spent a great many years observing human nature in small villages, which I have found to be not so very different from human nature anywhere else. Which is to say, Inspector, that we are all quite capable of the most extraordinary deceptions when we believe our happiness or security depends upon it." "A philosophical observation," Hartley said carefully. "But I'm investigating a poisoning." "Precisely," Miss Marple continued. "And poisoning, you see, is rarely an impulsive crime. It requires planning, access, knowledge of toxins, and most importantly, the ability to maintain composure in the presence of the consequences. I have found that such composure often masks secrets far more damaging than the crime itself." Hartley studied her with renewed attention. There was something unusual about this woman, the kind of perceptiveness that came only with either genuine wisdom or very careful observation. "Are you suggesting, Miss Marple, that someone in this room poisoned Mr. Ashworth?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple said gently, that someone in this room knew the pudding was poisoned before Mr. Ashworth consumed it, and that someone made a deliberate choice about what to do or not to do with that knowledge. Eleanor went very still. "That's absurd," she said, but her voice had lost some of its steadiness. "I made that pudding 3 weeks ago. No one had access to it, except..." She stopped abruptly, and Hartley's attention sharpened. "Except whom, Mrs. Ashworth?" "Except me," Eleanor finished. But her hesitation had been noted, catalogued, and filed away in the inspector's mind for later examination. "The pudding," Hartley said, turning to his sergeant, who had been recording details in his notebook, "was kept where, exactly?" "In the pantry," Eleanor said. "In a locked cupboard. I've kept it locked for the past 3 weeks. Only I had the key. Only you." Hartley asked, "Are you quite certain?" Eleanor's fingers twisted together. "Yes, well, the key hangs in the kitchen, on the wall behind the dresser. Anyone in the household might have known where it was located." "Ah," Hartley said softly, "so not as secure as we might have initially believed." Margaret had lifted her eyes from her distant point of focus, and they were now fixed on her mother with an expression of mingled confusion and something else, something that might have been suspicion. Richard was leaning back now, his arm still around Catherine, but his attention focused intently on Eleanor. Robert's absence was beginning to assert itself as a presence of its own, a void that pulled at everyone's awareness. "May I ask," Miss Marple ventured, "what sort of poison was used?" Hartley considered whether to answer. There was nothing in his experience that suggested this information should be withheld. "We won't know precisely until the post-mortem examination is complete. But the preliminary indicators suggest a poison that produces exactly the symptoms we observed: the metallic taste, the difficulty in breathing, the paralysis. It's not a poison that a household typically keeps on hand, which means our poisoner brought it into this house deliberately, or obtained it once they arrived," Miss Marple suggested thoughtfully. "The village chemist is closed on Christmas Eve," Hartley replied, "and has been for some hours. But a veterinarian would have access to strychnine," Miss Marple observed quietly. "It's used for certain types of animal poisoning, is it not?" The implication hung in the air between them. Richard made a small sound of outrage. Catherine gripped his arm more tightly. Eleanor's face had gone a shade paler than the white tablecloth that still bore the spreading wine stain from the dinner table. "You're suggesting," Hartley said slowly, "that Mr. Ashworth poisoned his own pudding." "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple said gently, "that we should perhaps examine what each person in this house wanted from Robert Ashworth's death, and what they might have been willing to do to achieve it." "That's preposterous," Richard protested. "The man is dead. Someone poisoned him. We should be helping you find out who, not sitting about making accusations." "Quite right," Hartley agreed, though his eyes remained fixed on Miss Marple's composed face. "Tell me, Mrs. Ashworth, did Mr. Ashworth have any will? Any property? Any insurance policies that would benefit members of this household?" Eleanor's silence was answer enough. Hartley closed his notebook with a decisive snap. "I think," he said, "that we're going to need to have several very long conversations with each of you, separately, beginning immediately." As the family was ushered from the drawing room in small, carefully supervised groups, Miss Marple returned to her knitting. Her needles clicked with their familiar rhythm, and her expression remained serene and thoughtful. But there was something in the set of her mouth, something in the angle of her jaw, that suggested she knew far more than she'd yet revealed. Robert Ashworth had been poisoned with strychnine on Christmas Eve. And now the real investigation could begin, not the police investigation with its procedural requirements and legal constraints, but the far more subtle investigation that only Miss Marple was truly qualified to conduct. She had already begun. In fact, the moment she'd refused that first taste of pudding. Chapter 4. The Obvious Suspects. By Christmas morning, Thornfield Manor had been transformed into something resembling a crime scene investigation more than a family home. Inspector Hartley had interviewed each family member privately, his questions becoming increasingly pointed and specific. The financial records that Eleanor kept in her writing desk had been examined with meticulous care, revealing a picture of mounting debt that no one had anticipated. "Your mother has been hemorrhaging money for the past 5 years," Hartley explained to Richard in the library, where the inspector had convened what amounted to a preliminary summary of his findings. He had requested that Miss Marple attend as well, ostensibly as a village character who might provide additional insight, though Hartley suspected his real motive was to observe her reactions. The property taxes alone are consuming nearly 70% of her annual income. Repairs to the house have been deferred. The staff has been quietly reduced. By my calculations, Mrs. Ashworth would have been bankrupt within another 18 months. Richard's face had gone very red. Mother never mentioned any of this to me. If she'd asked, I could have helped. I have considerable resources, which, I suspect, Hartley interrupted smoothly, she was too proud to request. However, Mr. Ashworth's will, which your solicitor was kind enough to provide this morning, reveals that your uncle was planning to leave his entire estate to your mother. Approximately £80,000, plus a substantial property in the village, enough to solve all of her financial difficulties. You think my mother poisoned her own brother-in-law? Richard stood abruptly, his outrage apparently genuine. That's absurd. She would never what? Hartley asked conversationally. Never consider her financial security. Never take steps to ensure her home remained hers. Never contemplate that her brother-in-law's death might be a convenient solution to an intolerable situation. In the drawing room, Miss Marple sat with her knitting, observing the proceedings with those pale, attentive eyes. She had watched as Hartley presented his theory to each family member in turn. Eleanor's desperation over money, Richard's access to his uncle through childhood visits, Margaret's recent financial devastation from the divorce settlement, even Catherine's discovery that Robert had made advances toward her 6 months. Prior an indiscretion she had never mentioned to Richard, but it was the financial motive that seemed to captivate Hartley. He built his case around it with the methodical certainty of a man who believed he had found the truth. The poison was purchased, Hartley announced on the morning of Boxing Day, addressing the family in the drawing room once more, by someone who had specific knowledge of its effects and access to veterinary supplies. We have established that strychnine was missing from the local veterinary clinics. Inventory. Mr. Ashworth noticed the shortage 3 weeks ago, precisely the time frame during which the pudding was made and stored. Are you suggesting Uncle Robert reported his own missing poison? Margaret asked, her voice hollow. She looked as though she hadn't slept in the 2 days since the murder. That makes no sense. Unless, Hartley said, he was deliberately creating an alibi, reporting the theft to establish that he couldn't possibly be the poisoner, when in fact he was planting evidence to incriminate someone else. Miss Marple set down her knitting with a soft click. Inspector, might I ask a rather practical question? Hartley turned to her with the deference he'd come to show the elderly woman. Of course, Miss Marple, If Mr. Ashworth poisoned his own pudding with the intention of incriminating someone else, what was his intention regarding his own survival? Surely he would have known that the pudding would be consumed by his family, and that the poison would not discriminate between intended and unintended victims. Hartley's expression flickered just for a moment, but Miss Marple caught it. Perhaps he made an error in judgment. Perhaps, Miss Marple agreed gently. Though in my experience, suicide by poisoning in a family context is rarely undertaken without careful consideration. It would seem to me that if Mr. Ashworth had wished to die, there would have been far simpler methods available to a man of his profession and intelligence. Eleanor had her hands folded in her lap, her knuckles white with tension. Inspector, are you accusing me or not? Because if you are, I believe I should speak with my solicitor. Your mother, Richard interjected, would never poison anyone. I don't care what the financial records show. I know my mother, do you? Hartley asked. You live in London. You see her perhaps 3 times a year. You were unaware of her financial situation despite being her eldest son. How well can you truly claim to know her? It was a cruel observation, but Hartley delivered it with the clinical detachment of a man who had learned that cruelty, in the service of truth, was sometimes necessary. Yet even as he spoke, even as the family stirred in response to his accusations, Miss Marple's expression remained thoughtful and unconvinced. That evening, as Eleanor sat in the drawing room alone, Miss Marple found her there. The older woman moved with her characteristic quiet grace and settled into the chair opposite without asking permission. You're troubled, Miss Marple observed. My brother-in-law is dead, Eleanor said flatly. My family is under suspicion. The police think I poisoned him for money. Of course, I'm troubled. That's not what troubles you, Miss Marple said gently. If you'd poisoned him, you would be afraid of discovery or consumed with guilt. Neither of those emotions seems to be primary in your current state. Instead, you seem to be troubled by something you know but cannot articulate. Eleanor looked at her sharply. What could I possibly know that the police don't? That, Miss Marple said, is precisely what I've been wondering. You see, I observed something rather curious on the evening of the Christmas dinner, when Inspector Hartley asked you about the pudding and who had access to it. You began to explain, and then you stopped yourself. You were about to reveal something, and then you decided not to. I said no such thing, Eleanor protested. But her voice was unconvincing. You said that only you had the key, but then you qualified that statement. However, what I noticed was not what you said, but what you didn't say. You didn't mention that someone else had been in the pantry recently. Someone who might have noticed where the key was kept. Eleanor's face had gone very pale. You're mistaken, am I? Miss Marple picked up her knitting, the needles resuming their familiar rhythm. Or did you perhaps tell someone where the key was kept? Did you, perhaps, have a conversation about the pudding with someone in this house? Someone who expressed curiosity about it. The silence stretched between them, filled only with the click of knitting needles and the crackle of the fire. If I tell you, Eleanor said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, it will make things worse, not better. It will make people suspect the wrong person. Then you do know something, Miss Marple said softly. The question, Mrs. Ashworth, is whether your silence is protecting someone you love, or allowing someone dangerous to escape justice. Those two things are not always the same. Eleanor turned her face away, toward the window, where snow had begun to fall again, obliterating the landscape in white. She did not answer, but her trembling hands suggested that the weight of whatever she knew was becoming increasingly unbearable. Somewhere in the house, the real murderer moved through the corridors, confident in their deception, believing that the obvious suspects, Eleanor's financial desperation, the missing poison from Robert's clinic, the convenient inheritance was sufficient to obscure the truth. But Miss Marple, sitting quietly with her knitting, knew better. The real truth was far more complex, far more human, and far more damning than any of the theories Hartley had thus far proposed, and Eleanor's silence was the key to unlocking it. Chapter 5. The detail and the darkness. On the morning of the second day after Robert's death, while Inspector Hartley was occupied with paperwork in Eleanor's study and the family remained confined to their rooms under his implicit instruction not to leave the premises, Miss Marple undertook what she described to anyone who asked as a simple constitutional walk through the house. She was, after all, a guest, and a guest might reasonably wish to stretch her legs and reacquaint herself with the corridors of Thornfield Manor. No, one questioned her, though had they paid close attention, they might have noticed that her walk was remarkably systematic, almost architectural in its precision. She moved from the dining room through the butler's pantry, pausing to examine the cupboard where the pudding had been stored. The lock was unremarkable, a simple brass mechanism that would have required no specialized knowledge to open. The space inside smelled faintly of brandy and spices, and on the shelf where the pudding had rested, she observed a faint discoloration in the dust, as though something had been removed and then replaced. From there, she progressed to the kitchen where Mrs. Pritchard, the cook, was preparing a somber lunch. The kitchen was precisely as Eleanor had described, orderly, traditional, and dominated by a large dresser against the far wall. Miss Marple examined the area behind the dresser where Eleanor had indicated the key was kept, and found the space exactly as one might expect, a small hook, empty now, with a faint outline in the dust suggesting how frequently the key had been removed. "Dreadful business," Mrs. Pritchard murmured, not looking up from the vegetables she was preparing. The cook had been at Thornfield for 23 years, longer than Eleanor herself in some respects, and had maintained an admirable composure throughout the entire ordeal. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed. "Tell me, Mrs. Pritchard, did Mr. Ashworth ever visit the kitchen during his stays at Thornfield?" The cook paused, her knife hovering above the carrot she was slicing. "Rarely, madam. He was a gentleman of the old sort. He didn't involve himself in domestic affairs. And yet," Miss Marple continued gently, "he would have known where such things are kept. He visited for 30 years, after all. I suppose anyone living in the house long enough would notice where the key hangs," Mrs. Pritchard said, resuming her slicing with perhaps more vigor than necessary. "It's hardly hidden." "No, it's not hidden at all," Miss Marple agreed. "But it is, as you say, noticed, and forgetting such details, or rather, remembering them at crucial moments, is precisely how these matters work themselves out." After leaving the kitchen, Miss Marple made her way to the library, where she found Richard attempting to work through correspondence that had accumulated during the Christmas crisis. He looked exhausted, his face drawn, his earlier indignation replaced by a kind of hollow resignation. "Miss Marple," he said, rising politely, "I trust you're comfortable despite the circumstances." "Quite comfortable, thank you," she replied, settling into a chair near the window. "Though I confess, I've been wondering about a rather practical matter. When the pudding was served on Christmas Eve, I noticed that Mrs. Ashworth served everyone except herself quite promptly. And yet, when she did finally serve herself, Her portion appeared to be the same size as everyone else's. Tell me, how does one manage to serve from a communal pudding in such a way that one can guarantee an equal portion? Richard looked confused by the question. I'm not certain I follow you. It's quite simple, Miss Marple explained. When one is serving a pudding from a single dish, the portions depend upon where the slice is cut. The first portions are generous. The last portions might be quite small, depending upon how much has been removed. And yet Mrs. Ashworth managed to serve identical portions to each person, including, eventually, herself. That would suggest either remarkable equanimity or remarkable practice. Or perhaps, she added thoughtfully, remarkable familiarity with precisely how many portions the pudding contained before the meal. Richard shifted uncomfortably. I'm not sure what you're implying, Miss Marple. I'm implying nothing at all, she said gently. I'm merely observing. It's a hobby of mine, you understand. Observation, I've found it, answers more questions than asking does. The afternoon brought a discovery that, while seemingly insignificant to anyone who might have noticed it, struck Miss Marple with the force of revelation. She was in the morning room, ostensibly reading a novel from Eleanor's collection, when she observed Margaret entering the side garden through the French doors. The younger woman was moving furtively, glancing behind her as though afraid of being observed. Miss Marple set aside her book and, after a discreet interval followed, she found Margaret in the garden's far corner, where the rose bushes, dormant in winter, created a sheltered alcove. The young woman was digging in the frozen earth with a small gardening trowel, her hands shaking, her breath coming in small gasps. When she lifted something from the ground, Miss Marple saw, even from a distance, that it was a small glass bottle, empty now, its label worn and illegible. Margaret clutched it to her chest, and Miss Marple watched as the younger woman's face crumpled with what appeared to be a combination of relief and anguish. She buried the bottle again, covered the spot with fallen leaves, and then stood motionless for a long moment before returning to the house. Miss Marple remained where she was, hidden among the dormant plants, her knitting needles still in her hands despite the cold. She had been working on the same grey scarf for days now, adding length without visible progress, and it provided an excellent excuse for standing quietly in gardens and observing things that others wished to remain unobserved. What she had just witnessed was not the action of a guilty person attempting to hide evidence. It was the action of someone hiding something, certainly, but something far more complex than simple guilt. The relief on Margaret's face, the way she had retrieved the bottle as though retrieving something precious, the deliberate care with which she had reburied it, these suggested not concealment of evidence, but concealment of something that, if discovered, would require explanation that Margaret was not yet prepared to give. By evening, Miss Marple had added another layer to the growing complexity of the case. She knew, with the certainty that came from decades of careful observation, that at least 3 people in Thornfield Manor were keeping secrets. Eleanor was protecting someone. Margaret was hiding something that had been buried in the garden. And Richard, she suspected, was aware of far more than his indignation had suggested. As for Inspector Hartley, he remained convinced that Eleanor's financial desperation was motive enough, that the missing strychnine was proof enough, that the inheritance was explanation enough. He was building toward an arrest. Miss Marple was certain of it. Within another day or two, he would have sufficient circumstantial evidence to charge Eleanor with her brother-in-law's murder. But Miss Marple knew better. The bottle in the garden, whatever it had contained, was the key. Not the obvious key that Hartley was pursuing with such methodical certainty, but the real key, the one that unlocked not only who had poisoned Robert Ashworth, but why. And as she returned to the house in the gathering darkness, Miss Marple had already begun to construct a theory so terrible, so utterly human in its desperation, that she knew she would need to be absolutely certain before revealing it. Because if she was right, the real murderer was not a person acting from greed or impulse, but someone acting from a kind of terrible love that had twisted into something far more poisonous than the strychnine that had killed Robert Ashworth. Chapter 6. Secrets within secrets. Inspector Hartley was preparing to make an arrest when Miss Marple requested a private audience with him in Eleanor's study. It was late afternoon on the third day after Robert's death, and the inspector had assembled what he believed was an airtight case: Eleanor's financial desperation, the missing the inheritance that would solve all monetary difficulties, and most damningly, Eleanor's own admission that she had exclusive access to the pudding's storage location. Miss Marple, Hartley said, gesturing for her to sit. "I appreciate your interest in this matter, but I believe we have reached a natural conclusion. The evidence against Mrs. Ashworth is circumstantial and incomplete," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "which is precisely why I felt compelled to conduct a few additional inquiries of my own. I hope you don't mind, Inspector. An old woman's curiosity, you understand." Hartley's expression suggested he minded considerably, but he gestured for her to continue. "I took the liberty of speaking with the headmistress of the village school," Miss Marple began, settling into her chair with the deliberate comfort of someone prepared for a lengthy conversation. "A Mrs. Whitmore, quite an elderly woman now, though she was teaching when several of your suspects were children. She recalls, quite distinctly, that Margaret Ashworth, then Margaret Crenshaw, of course, was an extraordinarily lonely child. No friends, kept apart from her peers, rather withdrawn. And do you know what Mrs. Whitmore attributed this to?" "I cannot imagine," Hartley said dryly. "Margaret's mother was quite ill during Margaret's childhood. A nervous condition, Mrs. Whitmore believed, though the precise nature was never discussed. Eleanor kept the girl at home frequently, and when Margaret did attend school, she was preoccupied, distracted. The girl seemed to carry an excessive burden of anxiety for someone so young." Hartley frowned. "I fail to see the relevance." "Nor would I," Miss Marple agreed, "except that I also took the liberty of visiting the doctor who attended Eleanor during that period. Dr. Coleman, retired now, but with excellent memory. He was quite clear that Eleanor suffered from a profound fear of childbirth. After Margaret's arrival, Eleanor was unable to conceive again despite her husband's wishes for a son. The anxiety this created was substantial, and Eleanor eventually sought treatment for what she believed was a constitutional weakness of the nerves." "Miss Marple, patience, Inspector," she said gently. "I am nearly finished. Now, combine that with the information I gleaned from speaking with Catherine yesterday, information she was quite reluctant to share, I might add, regarding her relationship with Robert Ashworth. According to Catherine, Robert made advances toward her approximately 6 months ago. Not merely conversational flirtation, but something considerably more persistent and inappropriate. Catherine resisted, and she was sufficiently disturbed by the experience that she confided in Richard. However, she requested that Richard say nothing to Eleanor, believing that the knowledge would only cause her distress. Hartley leaned back in his chair. "You're suggesting that Robert's behavior toward Catherine is somehow relevant to his murder?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple said carefully, "that Robert Ashworth was not the man everyone believed him to be, and that his death was not solely motivated by financial necessity, but by something far more complex. That evening, Miss Marple found Eleanor in the drawing room, sitting in near darkness, the fire reduced to embers. The older woman did not turn on the lights, but simply settled into the chair beside Eleanor and took up her knitting. "I know what was buried in the garden," Miss Marple said without preamble. "Or rather, I believe I do. A bottle containing some sort of medication, I should think. Something prescribed for a nervous condition. Something that Margaret has been taking, or perhaps was meant to take." Eleanor's hands trembled. "You have no right. I have every right that compassion grants," Miss Marple said gently. "Tell me, Mrs. Ashworth, what happened to your daughter?" The silence stretched for a long moment. Then Eleanor began to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "Margaret has suffered from nervous attacks her entire life. Severe anxiety, panic, the kind that makes it nearly impossible for her to function in social situations. After her husband left her for that dreadful woman from Surrey, Margaret's condition deteriorated significantly. The doctor prescribed medication, a new thing, quite expensive. It helped, but it also made her drowsy, and Margaret decided she didn't want to take it anymore." Eleanor paused, her aged hands working mechanically with the knitting needles. "Robert noticed," Eleanor continued. "He began paying attention to Margaret in ways that were unsettling. He would touch her shoulder. He would find excuses to be alone with her. And Margaret, in her fragile state, began to believe that perhaps Robert's attention meant something genuine. She became confused about his intentions. And you discovered this?" Miss Marple prompted. "I found them together in the library one afternoon. Robert's hands were on Margaret's face, and Margaret was crying. When he saw me, he simply walked away as though nothing had occurred. He said nothing to me. He treated the whole thing as though Margaret had imagined it." Eleanor's voice cracked slightly. "That man was predatory, Miss Marple. He took advantage of my daughter's vulnerability. And when I confronted him, when I demanded that he keep away from her, he laughed. He told me that Margaret was a grown woman and he was simply being kind to her, kind, as though his inappropriate attention was somehow a gift. So you decided to poison him," Hartley said from the doorway, where he had been listening to the entire confession. He moved into the room with slow, measured steps. "To protect your daughter." Eleanor turned to face the inspector, and Miss Marple saw something shift in the older woman's expression. It was not guilt or fear, but something far more dangerous, a mother's absolute conviction that she had been justified. "I did no such thing," Eleanor said coldly, "though I would have, if I thought it necessary. But I didn't need to, you see, because Margaret had already made her decision." The words hung in the air between them, and Miss Marple felt a terrible understanding begin to crystallize. "Margaret poisoned him?" Hartley asked, incredulous. "Margaret retrieved the strychnine from Uncle Robert's clinic," Eleanor said, her voice now steady and controlled. "She had obtained the key to the pantry cupboard. She put the poison in the pudding while I was occupied with Christmas preparations. She did it herself, Inspector, because she finally understood that she needed to protect herself. I only discovered what she had done after Robert had consumed the pudding, and I kept quiet because she is my daughter, and no court in England would judge a frightened, vulnerable woman for protecting herself against predatory behavior." Miss Marple's needles had stilled. In the shadows of the drawing room, with only the ember glow of the dying fire to illuminate the scene, the terrible logic of what had occurred became devastatingly clear. Not Eleanor protecting her property through her brother-in-law's death, but Margaret pushed to her breaking point, taking the only action she believed would truly protect her from a man who had positioned himself as simultaneously a family member and a predator. "Where is Margaret?" Hartley asked, his voice tight. "Gone," Eleanor said simply. "She left the house this morning while you were reviewing files. She took the morning train to London. By now, she's likely on a ship to France. I provided her with money and a new traveling name." Hartley turned toward the door to issue orders, but Miss Marple's quiet voice stopped him. "Inspector, before you pursue the matter further, you should perhaps consider what precisely you intend to charge her with. A young woman protecting herself from sexual predation. A woman whose vulnerability was deliberately exploited by a family member. The courts will be very interested in those details, I suspect. Very interested indeed." Eleanor looked at Miss Marple with something approaching gratitude, and the old woman simply returned to her knitting, her needles clicking steadily in the darkness. Chapter 7. The letter. Inspector Hartley issued a warrant for Margaret's arrest within the hour, but the trail had already grown cold. By the time his officers reached the railway station in the adjacent county, Margaret Crenshaw had vanished into the vast machinery of London's transportation system. She had used an assumed name, paid in cash, and left no forwarding address. Hartley's frustration was evident in the way he moved through Thornfield Manor. His earlier certainty transformed into something resembling irritation at having the case slip through his fingers. But it was during the search of Margaret's room, a search conducted with the kind of thorough brutality that police investigations require, that something entirely unexpected emerged. A letter, tucked into the lining of Margaret's suitcase, addressed in careful handwriting to "My dear Margaret." It was dated 3 months prior, well before Robert's death, and the signature at the bottom caused Hartley to summon Miss Marple immediately. "Read this," he said, his voice strained, "and tell me if your theory regarding Miss Margaret Crenshaw still holds credence." Miss Marple took the letter with the care one might show an artifact of genuine historical significance. Her pale eyes moved across the page with deliberate slowness, and as she read, her expression shifted from curiosity to something far more complex, something approaching dismay. The letter was from Catherine. "My dear Margaret," it began, "I write this in the strictest confidence, knowing that you alone will understand the full weight of what I must convey. I can no longer bear the silence, and you must know the truth about your uncle." Catherine's words detailed a history far more disturbing than a mere 6 months of inappropriate behavior. She wrote of Robert's attention beginning years earlier, when she and Richard had first married. She described a pattern of escalating boundary violations, comments about her appearance, excuses to touch her hand or shoulder, requests to be alone with her that Richard had dismissed as avuncular affection. But most damningly, Catherine wrote of an incident 6 weeks before the letter was written, in which Robert had explicitly propositioned her, using language that left no room for misinterpretation. "I have told no one except you," Catherine's letter continued, "because I know that Richard would not believe me, or worse, would believe me and destroy his own family, attempting to confront his uncle. But Margaret, I believe he has done this to others. I believe he has been doing it for decades. And I believe that if someone does not stop him, he will continue to prey on vulnerable women. I cannot do it myself, but perhaps you, with your own experience of his attentions, might find the courage I lack." The final paragraph was chilling in its implications. "If you choose to act, I will stand by your decision, though I cannot openly acknowledge it. This letter will disappear, and I will deny ever having written it. But know that you would not be acting alone, even if the world believes you to be. Hartley looked up from the letter, his expression grim. This changes matters considerably. It transforms Miss Margaret from a woman defending herself into part of a conspiracy. And it implicates Mrs. Richard Ashworth in that minimum conspiracy to commit murder. But Miss Marple was frowning, her attention fixed on a particular passage in the letter. She read it again, then a third time, her needle-sharp intellect clearly working through something that the inspector had not yet perceived. "Inspector," she said slowly, "I believe you have misread the significance of this letter." "Have I?" Hartley asked, his frustration evident. "Catherine explicitly encourages Margaret to take action against Robert. That constitutes Catherine writes that if Margaret chooses to act, she will stand by that decision. She does not encourage the act itself. Rather, she provides context that might justify it should it occur. But more importantly," Miss Marple continued, her voice taking on a quality of careful deliberation, "what strikes me is what Catherine does not say. And what is that? She does not say that she herself is afraid for Margaret's safety. She does not express concern about what Robert might do if left unchecked. Instead, she frames the matter entirely around the vulnerability of women generally and Robert's pattern of behavior. She presents herself as Margaret's confederate in principle, but she carefully maintains plausible deniability regarding any specific action." Hartley moved to argue, but Miss Marple raised a hand. "I believe we should speak with Mrs. Richard Ashworth," she said, "and I believe we should do so in the presence of her husband." Despite her likely reluctance, the conversation that followed, conducted in Eleanor's drawing room with Miss Marple, Hartley, and the Ashworths present, revealed layers of deception that suggested the case was far more complex than anyone had yet comprehended. Catherine, initially defiant, eventually confessed that yes, she had written the letter. Yes, she had deliberately provided Margaret with information about Robert's predatory patterns, but she vehemently denied any role in the actual poisoning. "I wrote that letter because I was terrified," Catherine said, her voice shaking. "I believed that if Margaret understood the pattern, if she knew she wasn't alone, she might find the courage to protect herself. But I didn't know she would die, didn't know she was planning, you didn't know she was planning to murder him." Hartley finished coldly. "I hoped she would go to the police," Catherine said. "I hoped she would find an adult, another woman, someone who could help her. I never imagined, you never imagined, that a frightened, vulnerable woman would take matters into her own hands." Miss Marple asked gently, "How interesting, Mrs. Ashworth, given that you yourself seem to have done precisely that." Everyone turned to look at the elderly woman. "You see," Miss Marple continued, "Catherine's letter accomplishes several things simultaneously. It provides Margaret with justification for action. It absolves Catherine of direct responsibility by maintaining the fiction of uncertainty. It ensures that if Margaret does act, Catherine has created a paper trail that establishes her sympathies without implicating her in the crime itself. And most importantly, it transforms what might otherwise appear to be an isolated act of self-defense into part of a larger conspiracy." "That's not fair," Catherine protested. "I wrote that letter out of genuine concern for Margaret." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said. "Or perhaps you wrote it because you understood that Margaret, in her vulnerable state, was more likely to act than you were, and you sought to use her as your instrument of liberation. After all, a poison in a family pudding. A murder committed at a family gathering, such circumstances would immediately turn suspicion toward the family itself. And who would be safer from suspicion than the wife of the eldest son? The woman who had demonstrated, through her own fearfulness and docility, that she lacked the strength for such action. Richard's face had gone ashen. "Catherine, tell me she's wrong. Tell me you didn't, that you wouldn't. I didn't know what Margaret was planning," Catherine said, but her voice had lost conviction. "I wrote the letter because I was desperate. I was terrified of what he might do next, what he might have already done to others. I wanted someone to act." "But you didn't want to act yourself," Miss Marple said. "You wanted someone else, someone more desperate, more vulnerable, more expendable to do it for you. And that, Mrs. Ashworth, is perhaps the most insidious crime of all. Not the poisoning, but the deliberate manipulation of another person's desperation to accomplish what you lacked the courage to attempt yourself." The silence that followed was profound and utterly damning. Catherine had begun to cry, not tears of grief, but tears of anger and despair. Richard had turned away, unable to look at his wife. And Eleanor, watching from her chair, looked at Miss Marple with something approaching awe. "What happens now?" Eleanor asked quietly. "That," Hartley said, "depends on whether we can locate Miss Margaret Crenshaw and determine precisely what her state of mind was when she poisoned her uncle. If she was acting entirely of her own volition, then she bears sole responsibility. If she was manipulated by her sister-in-law's carefully constructed narrative, then we must consider conspiracy. Either way, Mrs. Richard Ashworth has considerable explaining to do." But even as Hartley spoke, Miss Marple was thinking about something else entirely. Catherine's letter had been carefully constructed to avoid implication while still encouraging action. But there was something about the timing, about the way the letter had been written 3 months prior, about the meticulous way Catherine had maintained plausible deniability. It suggested not impulsive desperation, but calculated planning, and if that was true, then perhaps Catherine was far more dangerous than anyone had yet realized. Chapter 8. The psychological game. Inspector Hartley had established a temporary office in Eleanor's study, where he conducted interviews with methodical precision and accumulating frustration. The case, which had seemed so clear only hours earlier, had developed into something far more complex and troublingly ambiguous. Catherine had admitted to writing the letter, but vehemently denied knowing in advance that Margaret intended to poison Robert. Without Margaret in custody, without a confession from the actual murderer, without clear evidence of conspiracy, Hartley found himself in the unenviable position of having multiple suspects and insufficient proof against any single one. It was in this atmosphere of uncertainty that Miss Marple requested permission to speak with Catherine. "Alone, I believe I might be able to clarify certain matters," she told Hartley with characteristic understatement. "Women of a certain age sometimes have insights into the behavior of younger women that might escape masculine observation." Hartley, desperate for any progress, agreed with barely concealed reluctance. Catherine sat in the morning room when Miss Marple entered, her back very straight, her hands folded in her lap with the kind of rigid composure that suggested she was holding herself together through sheer force of will. She had not slept since Eleanor's confession. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and there was a tremor in her voice when she acknowledged Miss Marple's presence. "Mrs. Ashworth," Miss Marple began, settling into a chair positioned at an angle that allowed her to observe Catherine's face while appearing to focus on her knitting. "I wonder if you might indulge an old woman's curiosity regarding a rather practical matter." Catherine nodded, though wariness crossed her features. "When you were courting your husband, Richard, that is, did you experience what I might describe as a period of adjustment? A time when the reality of married life differed somewhat from the expectation?" The question seemed to catch Catherine off guard. She hesitated, then said quietly, "All marriages have such a period, I suppose." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, her needles clicking steadily. "I've observed that young women often enter marriage with certain hopes regarding affection, attention, shared interests. And when reality proves somewhat different, it can create a kind of quiet desperation. Tell me, did Richard prove to be the sort of husband you had anticipated?" Catherine's jaw tightened. "Richard is a good man. He provides for me. He treats me well." "That's not quite what I asked," Miss Marple said gently. "I asked whether he proved to be the sort of husband you had anticipated. There's a distinction, you see. A man can be good and provide adequately without necessarily fulfilling the particular hopes one held." "I don't see how this is relevant," Catherine said. But her composure had cracked slightly. "It's relevant because it speaks to loneliness," Miss Marple explained. "I've found that the most dangerous emotional state for a woman is not desperation born of abuse or neglect, but rather the quiet loneliness of being married to someone who is emotionally distant. And Robert, from what I understand, provided you with something that Richard did not. Attention, perhaps, or a sense of being desired." Catherine's face went very pale. "That's not Ty, never, of course not," Miss Marple said, her tone remaining placid. "Robert was behaving inappropriately, and you resisted his advances. That's exactly what you've said. But I wonder if part of you didn't find his attention flattering, intoxicating, even. Not in a way that would lead you to encourage his behavior, but in a way that created a kind of emotional confusion." "Stop," Catherine whispered. "Please stop." Miss Marple set down her knitting and looked directly at the younger woman. "I'm going to tell you something, Mrs. Ashworth, because I believe you need to hear it. I am 73 years old, and I have spent decades observing human nature in all its complexity. I have seen women do terrible things when they felt they had been denied what they believed they deserved. And I have seen other women justify those terrible things by framing them as noble, as necessary, as expressions of love or loyalty." Catherine had begun to cry silently, tears sliding down her cheeks without sound or apparent emotion. "The letter you wrote to Margaret," Miss Marple continued quietly, "was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. It validated her grievance against Robert while simultaneously suggesting that action was the only appropriate response. It made her feel powerful rather than powerless. It transformed her from a victim into an agent, and by doing so, you gave her permission to act on impulses that you yourself harbored but lacked the courage to implement." "I didn't know what she would do," Catherine said, "but the protest sounded hollow even to her own ears, didn't you?" Miss Marple asked. "Or did you hope she would do precisely what she did? After all, you wrote that letter 3 months before Robert's death, not in response to any immediate crisis, but as though you were carefully planting seeds and waiting to see what might grow from them. That suggests planning, Mrs. Ashworth. Deliberate, calculated planning." Catherine rose abruptly from her chair. "I want to speak with my husband. Do you?" Miss Marple asked. "I wonder if Richard would want to speak with you once he truly understood what that letter represented. A woman who felt rejected and neglected by her husband, using her fragile sister-in-law as an instrument of revenge against the man who had made her feel desirable." "You're wrong," Catherine said, but her voice was breaking. "You're wrong. I didn't, Ty wasn't. You weren't motivated by protecting Margaret," Miss Marple said gently. "You were motivated by humiliation. Robert rejected your implicit invitation. He pursued Margaret instead. which made you feel worthless and discarded. And so you wrote a letter designed to set events in motion that would remove him from your life and eliminate the source of your shame. The fact that Margaret was harmed in the process was, I suspect, something you managed to overlook in your pursuit of your own relief. Catherine fled the room, her composure finally shattered into open sobs. Miss Marple watched her go without apparent emotion, though her ancient eyes held something approximating sadness. Later, in the study with Inspector Hartley, Miss Marple delivered her assessment with the precision of a surgeon identifying a surgical site. Catherine Ashworth did not murder Robert, she said, but she deliberately set in motion the sequence of events that led to his death. She may not have known with certainty what Margaret would do, but she hoped, with the intensity of a woman scorned, that something would be done. She needed Robert removed from her life because his presence was a constant reminder of her own inadequacy in her husband's eyes. "Can we arrest her for conspiracy?" Hartley asked. "On what grounds?" Miss Marple replied, "A letter expressing sympathy for a woman's difficult situation. A letter that never explicitly encourages illegal action." Catherine was far too clever for that. She built plausible deniability into every line. Then she escapes justice entirely. Hartley said bitterly. "No," Miss Marple said, her voice taking on a harder edge. "She escapes legal justice, which is not the same thing. She will spend the rest of her life wondering whether she is a woman who protected another or a woman who exploited another's vulnerability for her own benefit. She will lie in bed next to a husband who now knows what she is capable of conceiving, even if she lacked the courage to execute it. That, Inspector, is a punishment far more exquisite than any court could impose." The next morning, Catherine left Thornfield Manor, claiming illness. Richard followed her to London 3 days later. The state of their marriage now uncertain in ways that neither would openly acknowledge, and Miss Marple, sitting alone in the drawing room with her knitting, reflected on how the human capacity for self-deception was perhaps the most universal poison of all. Chapter 9. The Truth Unveiled. Inspector Hartley stood in Eleanor's drawing room on the 7th day after Robert's death, regarding Miss Marple with an expression that suggested a man reaching the limits of his patience. Margaret Crenshaw had not been found. Catherine and Richard had departed for London. Eleanor remained at Thornfield under the shadow of suspicion, though Hartley lacked sufficient evidence to charge her with anything beyond obstruction of justice. The case had become a tangle of competing motives, murky psychology, and the infuriating reality that truth and justice were not always aligned. "Miss Marple," he said, with the formality of a man attempting to maintain professional courtesy, "I understand you have requested this final gathering. I assume you have something of significance to communicate." "I do," Miss Marple said gently. She had set aside her knitting, which was unusual enough to command immediate attention, though I fear what I must say will be neither comfortable nor simple. Eleanor was present, her face a mask of careful composure. Richard had returned from London the previous day, though without Catherine, and he sat with visible anguish. The twins, Emma and Thomas, stood by the window with the confused expressions of young people who understood they were present at something momentous but could not quite comprehend its significance. And Mrs. Pritchard, the cook, stood near the door, looking decidedly uncomfortable at being summoned to such a gathering. "The question that has plagued this investigation," Miss Marple began, "is not who poisoned the Christmas pudding, but rather who was the intended victim. We have assumed that Robert Ashworth was the intended target. But what if, in fact, he was not?" Hartley frowned. Mrs. Ashworth prepared the pudding 3 weeks in advance and kept it locked away. She had no reason to poison it for anyone other than Robert, as he was the only family member at that time. Precisely, Miss Marple interrupted gently. The pudding was made 3 weeks in advance. But circumstances changed. People arrived. New situations developed. New motivations emerged. Tell me, Inspector, what changed between the time the pudding was made and the time it was served? The silence that followed was profound. Hartley opened his mouth, closed it, and then said slowly, "Catherine arrived." "Catherine arrived," Miss Marple confirmed. And with her arrival came Robert's predatory behavior toward her, which she reported in a letter to Margaret. But more importantly, something else changed. Mrs. Ashworth's anxiety intensified dramatically. Why, do you suppose, would the arrival of her son's wife cause such distress? Eleanor's hands had begun to tremble. "Mrs. Ashworth," Miss Marple continued, turning her pale blue eyes toward the older woman, "you discovered something about Catherine and Robert, but not what you initially told Inspector Hartley. Not that Robert was pursuing Catherine. Rather, you discovered something about Catherine's own actions. Something that made you realize your family was in danger in ways you had never previously anticipated." "I don't know what you mean," Eleanor said, but her voice had lost all conviction. "I believe you do," Miss Marple said. "Mrs. Pritchard informed me during a casual conversation about the household routines that Catherine had been observed in the pantry on several occasions, ostensibly looking for items for household arrangements. She had access to the key. She knew where the pudding was kept. And unlike Margaret, who is fragile and vulnerable, Catherine is quite capable of premeditated action when she believes her interests are at stake." Richard made a small sound of protest. "Catherine wouldn't, she couldn't. Catherine," Miss Marple said, "wrote a letter to Margaret that was designed to encourage her toward violent action against Robert. But I believe that letter was not entirely genuine. I believe it was written knowing that Eleanor would discover it, knowing that Eleanor would be horrified, knowing that Eleanor's maternal instinct would activate toward Margaret. And I believe that, while Eleanor was focused on protecting Margaret, Catherine had already poisoned the pudding." "But Catherine didn't consume the pudding," Hartley said, still struggling with the logic. "She refused to eat it. If she had poisoned it, why would she avoid it?" "Because," Miss Marple explained, "Catherine believed the poisoned pudding was intended for someone else entirely. She believed it was meant for Eleanor." The room went absolutely still. "You see," Miss Marple continued, "Eleanor's financial situation was dire. Catherine understood this. But more importantly, Catherine understood something else. Eleanor stood between Richard and his inheritance. If Eleanor died, the estate would pass to Richard. The financial burdens would disappear. Catherine would gain access to significant wealth. And, more crucially, Catherine would be free of Eleanor's judgment and disapproval, who had always seen through Catherine's facade and recognized her as a woman more interested in advancement than in genuine feeling." Eleanor's tears had begun to flow. "Silently, you poisoned the pudding intending for your mother-in-law to consume it," Miss Marple said, addressing Eleanor directly. "You made the pudding and stored it knowing that you would someday use it. And then, when Catherine arrived with her letter and her predatory intent toward Robert, you realized that she might destroy Margaret entirely. So you changed your plan. You meant to poison Eleanor still, that was your original intention. But you altered the circumstances so that Robert would consume it first." "No," Eleanor whispered. "No, I didn't. But then something unexpected happened. Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle but inexorable. Richard tasted the pudding. Richard detected the poison and warned Catherine away from it. And Eleanor, watching her son narrowly escape death, made a decision. She decided to allow the pudding to remain as it was. She decided that if Robert consumed it, perhaps that was justice. Perhaps that was mercy. Perhaps that was what should happen. Hartley's expression had shifted from confusion to horrified understanding. You're saying that Mrs. Ashworth poisoned the pudding with the intention of murdering her own son. But when circumstances changed, she allowed her brother-in-law to become the victim instead. I'm saying, Miss Marple replied, that Eleanor Ashworth created a poison intended for one person and through a combination of events and choices, allowed it to be consumed by another. Whether that constitutes murder or mercy depends upon one's philosophical perspective, but it constitutes guilt, undoubtedly. Eleanor rose from her chair, her face aged a decade in the course of the conversation. You're wrong, she said. I never intended to harm Richard. I was going to destroy the pudding. I was going to admit what I'd done. But you didn't, Miss Marple said. You watched Robert consume it, and you let him die. Because he deserved to die, Eleanor said, her voice suddenly hard. Because he was predatory and corrupt. Because he was destroying my family. Because Catherine, she stopped abruptly, as if catching herself before revealing something she had not yet acknowledged. Because Catherine had already poisoned it, Miss Marple finished quietly. Before Eleanor could destroy it, Eleanor discovered Catherine in the pantry. Eleanor realized what Catherine had done. And Eleanor, faced with the impossible choice between protecting her son's marriage and preventing murder, chose to let events unfold as they would. The room erupted. Richard was on his feet, shouting denials. Thomas and Emma were crying. Mrs. Pritchard had covered her mouth with her hand. But Eleanor simply stood, her shoulders slightly bowed, as though she had been carrying this truth for so long that its exposure came as a kind of relief. Inspector, Miss Marple said, her voice cutting through the chaos, I believe you have sufficient evidence now to determine the appropriate charges, though I suspect the truth regarding who poisoned the pudding first. Eleanor or Catherine may never be entirely established, even to our own satisfaction, as Hartley began issuing instructions to his sergeant, as Eleanor was read her rights with mechanical precision, as the machinery of legal justice began to grind toward its inevitable conclusion. Miss Marple picked up her knitting and began to work once more, but her needles moved slowly, and her expression was thoughtful in a way that suggested she was contemplating not the triumph of her deduction, but the terrible cost of the truth she had revealed. Chapter 10. The return to silence the new year arrived at Thornfield Manor with little fanfare and even less joy. Eleanor had been formally charged with culpable negligence and conspiracy to commit murder, charges that carried a sentence of 15 years in prison. Catherine had been arrested in London on charges of attempted murder, and her solicitors were mounting a defense based on diminished responsibility and Catherine's claim that she had poisoned the pudding with the intention of harming Eleanor, not Robert. The legal machinery ground forward with the inevitability of clockwork, transforming human tragedy into procedural documents and courtroom testimony. But for the village of Thornfield itself, life had transformed in ways both subtle and profound. The Christmas decorations, still hanging in shop windows and on garden gates, took on an air of mockery. The spirit of goodwill that December had promised had been obliterated by the revelation that within one respectable family's home, multiple poisons had been prepared, multiple deaths had been contemplated, and the line between love and murder had proven far more porous than anyone had previously acknowledged. Mrs. Pritchard remained at Thornfield, overseeing the household as though Eleanor would shortly return to resume her position. But everyone understood that Thornfield Manor would never again be what it had been. Richard had separated from Catherine and had begun the process of seeking an annulment. Thomas and Emma were being sent to their uncle's home in Devon, until the scandal abated sufficiently for them to resume normal school attendance. And the house itself seemed to have taken on the quality of a museum dedicated to failure and dissolution. It was on the 10th of January that Miss Marple prepared to depart. She stood in the drawing room, her single suitcase packed, her knitting, the endless grey scarf that had never quite been completed, carefully folded within. "I cannot thank you sufficiently," Richard said, his voice hollow. He had aged a decade in the past 2 weeks, and his earlier affability had been replaced by something far more fragile and genuine. "You solved the case. You exposed the truth. I revealed the truth," Miss Marple corrected gently. "Whether I solved anything is a far more complex question. Solving implies that one has made something better. I'm not certain the truth has made anything better at all. My mother attempted to murder me," Richard said flatly. "Catherine attempted to murder my mother. And Robert, whatever his faults, died as a result of those competing crimes. How is that not a solution?" Miss Marple settled herself into a chair, as though she had decided that Richard deserved a final conversation before her departure. "Do you know what I learned during my 73 years of careful observation of human nature, Mr. Ashworth? I learned that the greatest tragedies are not committed by evil people acting from evil motives. The greatest tragedies are committed by ordinary people acting from desperation, fear, wounded pride, and the terrible conviction that they alone are justified in their actions. My mother poisoned a pudding," Richard said, his voice rising slightly. "She intended to." "Your mother," Miss Marple interrupted, "was drowning. Her home was being lost. Her property was slipping away. Everything she had built, everything she had sacrificed for, was disintegrating around her. And she believed, mistakenly, perhaps, but she believed, nonetheless, that your death would somehow solve those problems. Not your death in a vindictive sense, but your death as a release. She believed that you were suffering under the burden of supporting her, that your inheritance would provide you freedom." "That's madness," Richard protested. "Is it?" Miss Marple asked. "Or is it simply the logic of desperation?" And Catherine, in her own way, was also drowning. She had married a man who did not truly see her. She had been seduced and then rejected by another man in whom she had invested emotional hope. She had nowhere to turn, no one to confide in, and no solution available to her circumstances except to remove the obstacle that prevented her from inheriting wealth. Richard had begun to cry silently, his composure finally fracturing under the weight of understanding that both his mother and his wife had contemplated murder, and that understanding why did not make that knowledge any easier to bear. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. "Now," Miss Marple said, "life continues. Your mother will stand trial. Catherine will stand trial. Margaret, if she is ever found, will face her own legal reckoning. The village will gossip and speculate, and gradually, over the course of months and years, this scandal will fade into the background of local history. You will rebuild your life, though it will never be quite what you expected it to be. The twins will eventually understand that their family was not so different from countless other families in which desperation, deception, and love become hopelessly entangled. Will justice be served? Richard asked. Justice is a concept, Miss Marple replied, not a reality. What will occur is that the law will take its course. Eleanor will be imprisoned. Catherine will be imprisoned. Neither woman will receive what they deserve, because what they deserve understanding, compassion, recognition of their circumstances, precisely what the law cannot provide. Meanwhile, Robert will remain dead, and whatever justice his death represents will be hollow and unsatisfying. Mrs. Pritchard entered to announce that the car was ready to convey Miss Marple to the railway station. The old woman rose with the careful deliberation of someone conscious of her own fragility. Before I go, Miss Marple said to Richard, I want you to understand something. Your mother loved you. It's possible to love someone and to contemplate harming them. The human heart is complex, enough to contain such contradictions. Eleanor believed that she was loving you by removing the burden of supporting her. Catherine, in her deranged logic, believed she was improving your circumstances by securing wealth. None of this excuses their actions, but it does explain them in ways that might, over time, allow you to forgive them without necessarily condoning what they did. Will one, Richard asked, forgive them? I don't know, Miss Marple said honestly. But I suspect you'll eventually understand that withholding forgiveness will harm you far more than it will harm them. And perhaps that understanding will eventually lead to some form of peace. As Miss Marple's car departed Thornfield Manor, the village of Thornford seemed to release a long-held breath. Life would continue. The scandal would fade. New scandals would emerge to capture the village's attention. But something had fundamentally shifted in the understanding that the respectable English village contained within itself the capacity for murder, deception, and betrayal on a scale that most people preferred not to acknowledge. In her railway carriage, as the English countryside unfolded in grey January monotony outside her window, Miss Marple took out her knitting and resumed working on the endless grey scarf. Her needles clicked with their familiar rhythm, and her pale blue eyes gazed out at the landscape with the expression of someone who had seen too much to be surprised by anything, yet who remained fundamentally compassionate about human weakness. She thought about Eleanor in her cell, contemplating her crimes. She thought about Catherine, fighting her legal battles with desperation and cunning. She thought about Margaret, hopefully safe somewhere, attempting to rebuild a life shattered by circumstance and family dysfunction. And she thought about Robert, whose predatory behavior had set all these wheels in motion, yet who had become the instrument through which others' crimes achieved expression. Life was, Miss Marple reflected, far more complicated than justice could accommodate and far sadder than any observer would wish to acknowledge. But it was also fundamentally human, flawed, desperate, driven by needs both noble and base, and deserving of understanding even when understanding did not excuse behavior. The train carried her homeward, towards St. Mary Mead and the quiet rhythms of village life, where she would resume her observations of human nature with the same patient attention that had allowed her to solve the mystery of the poisoned Christmas pudding, and in her small cottage, surrounded by her needlework and her books and the accumulated knowledge of 73 years of careful watching, Miss Marple would reflect on what she had learned, that the greatest danger was not evil dressed in obvious darkness, but goodness twisted into something poisonous by desperation and fear. That was the true lesson of Thornfield Manor. Chapter 11. The trial 3 months had passed since Miss Marple's departure from Thornford, and the quiet village had gradually returned to its customary rhythms of gossip and speculation. However, The trial of Eleanor Ashworth had become a focal point of considerable public attention, attracting journalists from London and curious onlookers from surrounding villages. The case had captured the public imagination in ways that Inspector Hartley had never anticipated, not because it was sensational in the traditional sense, but because it presented a moral puzzle that resisted simple categorization. Miss Marple sat in the gallery of the courtroom on the opening day of Eleanor's trial, her presence noted but not remarked upon by most observers. She was, after all, simply an elderly woman attending a case in which she had been instrumental. What few people understood was that she had returned to Thornford, not from idle curiosity, but from a conviction that Eleanor's trial would reveal truths far more complex than those already exposed. The Crown's case was methodically presented by a prosecuting barrister named Whitmore, a man of moderate skill who relied upon the established facts. Eleanor had purchased strychnine 3 months prior under a false name in a neighboring county. She had possessed the only key to the pudding's storage location. She had access to the pudding throughout the 3 weeks it had been stored. Chemical analysis had confirmed that the poison had been added to the pudding at least 2 weeks before the Christmas dinner, and Eleanor had confessed to poisoning the pudding, though she maintained the rather questionable claim that her original intent had been to poison it for purposes of destroying it before anyone could consume it. The defense barrister, a woman named Mrs. Caroline Heather, offered a far more sympathetic narrative. She presented evidence of Eleanor's financial desperation, her mounting anxiety regarding the loss of her ancestral home, and her complete breakdown upon realizing what had occurred. She argued that Eleanor's mental state at the time of the poisoning had been substantially compromised by stress and fear. She called psychiatric witnesses who testified to Eleanor's history of anxiety and her potential vulnerability to what they termed temporary derangement, brought on by extreme circumstance. But it was Catherine's testimony that transformed the trial into something far more significant. Catherine had been offered a deal by the prosecution: testify truthfully against Eleanor in exchange for a reduced sentence on her own charges of attempted murder. She had accepted, and her appearance in the witness box created a sensation that reverberated through the courtroom with palpable force. Under Whitmore's questioning, Catherine calmly and methodically outlined her own poisoning of the pudding. She explained her discovery of Eleanor's tampering with the food. She detailed her own motivations with a candor that suggested either genuine remorse or sophisticated performance of same. And then, under cross-examination from Mrs. Heather, she made a statement that altered the entire trajectory of the case. I knew, Catherine said carefully, that Mrs. Ashworth had poisoned the pudding. I discovered her in the pantry at approximately 2 in the morning, standing over the pudding with a bottle of She didn't see me, but I saw her quite clearly. And what did you do? Mrs. Hetherington asked gently. I left, Catherine said. I said nothing. I went to my room and lay awake for hours, wondering what to do. And then I realized that Eleanor had created an opportunity. She had made it possible for someone else to administer poison without being obvious about it. So I obtained strychnine from Robert's clinic and added it to the pudding as well. Why would you do such a thing? Mrs. Hetherington asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Because Eleanor had already made the pudding lethal, Catherine said. And because I believed that if someone was going to consume poison, I preferred it to be Eleanor herself. Robert's death was an accident, an unfortunate convergence of circumstances. The gallery erupted. Judge Ashford's gavel came down sharply, demanding order, but the damage or perhaps the clarification had been done. The trial, which had been proceeding toward Eleanor's certain conviction, had suddenly become something far more ambiguous. Miss Marple watched as Mrs. Hetherington presented a closing argument that reframed the entire case. Yes, Eleanor had poisoned the pudding, but Eleanor had done so without knowledge that Catherine would add her own poison. Eleanor had, in fact, attempted to limit the damage by consuming the pudding. Herself on Christmas Eve, an attempt frustrated only by Richard's discovery of the poison's taste before Eleanor could sample the dessert. When Eleanor took the stand in her own defense, her testimony was quiet and devastatingly honest. "I poisoned the pudding," she said, her voice carrying no trace of defensiveness or self-pity. "I obtained strychnine with the intention of using it. I stored it in the pudding for 3 weeks, but I never intended for anyone to consume it. I intended to destroy it on Christmas morning, before anyone else could be harmed." "What changed your plan?" Mrs. Hetherington asked. "Catherine," Eleanor said simply. "I discovered her in the pantry. I understood what she had done, and I realized that the pudding was now doubly poisoned, that the situation had become far more dangerous than I had anticipated. I should have immediately revealed what had occurred. I should have called for the police. Instead, I allowed events to unfold. Why?" The barrister pressed. Eleanor's answer was the moment that transformed the trial from a legal proceeding into something approaching existential reckoning. "Because," Eleanor said, "Robert was predatory and corrupt, because he had wounded my family in ways that no one had adequately addressed, and because, in a moment of terrible clarity, I realized that his death, however it came about, would provide a kind of justice that the legal system never could. I allowed him to consume the poisoned pudding because part of me believed he deserved it." The courtroom erupted again. Judge Ashford called for order, but Eleanor's admission had severed whatever sympathy the jury might have felt for her as a victim of circumstance. She had moved from the category of desperate woman to the category of something far more troubling. A woman who had chosen to let another person die. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, their verdict was guilty on all counts: intentional poisoning, conspiracy to commit murder, and manslaughter by negligence. Eleanor Ashworth received a sentence of 12 years imprisonment, a sentence considered merciful given the severity of the charges. Catherine received 5 years for her own poisoning and attempted murder, with the understanding that her cooperation with the prosecution had resulted in the reduced sentence. And Margaret Crenshaw, despite intensive police efforts, was never found. She had vanished into the vastness of continental Europe, leaving behind only the mystery of her involvement and her ultimate fate. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her temporary lodgings in Thornford and reflected upon what the trial had revealed. Eleanor's final testimony suggested that she had not poisoned the pudding from desperation alone, but from a kind of dark justicey conviction that Robert deserved death for his predatory behavior. Catherine had poisoned it from wounded pride and desire for wealth. And Margaret, if she had indeed been involved, as Miss Marple still suspected, had poisoned it from the desperation of someone pushed beyond psychological tolerance. 3 women, 3 motives, 3 poisonings of the same pudding, all converging in the death of a single man who had positioned himself as a family member while behaving as a predator. Miss Marple took out her knitting. Grey scarf was finally complete and began work on a new project. Her pale blue eyes reflected the lamplight. and her expression suggested that she was contemplating not the verdict that had been rendered, but the far more complex justice that had somehow, through accident and intention combined, been achieved. Robert Ashworth was dead. Eleanor would spend years in prison. Catherine would emerge from prison transformed by her experience. And Margaret would spend the rest of her life wondering whether her family knew what she had done, and whether they had forgiven her. Justice, Miss Marple reflected, was far more complicated than law could ever accommodate. Chapter 12. What Remains It was the autumn of the following year when Miss Marple received an unexpected letter forwarded through 3 different addresses before reaching her. Cottage in St. Mary Mead. The envelope bore no return address, and the handwriting was carefully disguised in the manner of someone attempting to avoid recognition. Inside, a single sheet of paper contained a message written in French, the language Margaret had studied extensively in her youth, but had never had occasion to use professionally. Dear Miss Marple, the letter began, I do not expect forgiveness, nor do I deserve it, but I believed you should know that I survived, and that I have attempted to build a life away from England, away from the pain that consumed me there. I read about the trial. I know what my mother did, and what Catherine did, and what I did. I know that 3 women poisoned the same pudding with 3 different intentions, and that Uncle Robert died as a result of our collective desperation. I do not know if what occurred was justice or tragedy, or some incomprehensible combination of both, but I am alive, and I am attempting to live honorably. That is all I can offer. M. Miss Marple read the letter 3 times, her pale blue eyes reflecting lamplight as she contemplated what Margaret's survival meant for the complete narrative of Thornfield Manor. So Margaret had indeed been involved. Margaret had Margaret had poisoned the pudding, the first of the 3 women to do so, if Miss Marple's deductions had been correct, and Margaret had then escaped, leaving behind the mystery of her culpability and her ultimate fate. The letter itself posed a question. Should Miss Marple reveal its existence to the authorities? Margaret was a fugitive from justice, a woman who had poisoned her uncle and then fled the country. By law, Miss Marple's obligation was clear. By human compassion, it was far more ambiguous. Miss Marple did not answer the letter. She did not report its arrival to Inspector Hartley or to any official authority. Instead, she placed it carefully in an envelope and filed it away with her personal papers. A secret that she carried until her death and beyond her. Secret that suggested that not all mysteries, once solved, required public resolution. But the letter prompted Miss Marple to undertake a final review of the Thornfield case. One more examination of the threads and patterns that had woven themselves into tragedy. She gathered her notes, her observations, and her recollections, and she composed a summary that she filed away for posterity, not intended for publication, but rather as a kind of personal testament to the complexity of human motivation and the failure of systems of justice to adequately address genuine wrong. In her summary, Miss Marple articulated what the trial had obscured and what legal proceedings had failed to clarify. That the poisoning of the Christmas pudding had not been a single crime, but a convergence of 3 separate crimes, each born of legitimate grievance, twisted into criminal action. Margaret had poisoned the pudding because Robert had exploited her vulnerability, had preyed upon her fragile mental state, had positioned himself as a family member while behaving as a predator. Margaret's act was one of self-defense stretched beyond its natural bounds. Desperation seeking outlet through the only means available to someone without power, status, or allies, Eleanor had poisoned the pudding because her world was collapsing, because she faced the loss of everything she had built and protected, because her son bore the burden of supporting her, because she believed that her own death might paradoxically save his life. Eleanor's act was one of maternal sacrifice corrupted by desperation and mental anguish. A woman seeking to solve an impossible situation through the only method that seemed available. Catherine had poisoned the pudding because she had been wounded by rejection, because she resented her powerlessness in a marriage that had failed to fulfill her expectations, because she saw in Eleanor's financial crisis an opportunity to improve her own circumstances. Catherine's act was one of opportunism dressed in the language of protection, calculated manipulation masquerading as sisterly concern. 3 crimes. 3 motivations. 3 women who had never conspired together, never communicated about their intentions, yet whose independent actions had converged to produce a single death. And that death, Robert's death, had somehow, in its randomness and convergence, achieved a kind of rough justice that no court of law could have deliberately engineered. What struck Miss Marple most forcefully was the question of accountability. Eleanor had been imprisoned for actions that, while criminal, were driven by desperation and mental collapse. Catherine had received a reduced sentence because she cooperated with prosecutors, despite her crime being motivated by naked self. And Margaret, the one woman whose act might most clearly be defended as such, had escaped any legal consequences whatsoever by simply disappearing. This inversion of justice haunted Miss Marple in ways that the mystery itself had not. It suggested that legal systems, however well-intentioned, were fundamentally incapable of addressing the true moral complexity of human action. They could categorize and punish, but they could not understand the desperation that drove people toward criminality. They could impose sentences, but they could not address the circumstances that had made those sentences necessary. By the spring following the trial, Richard Ashworth had moved to America to escape the scandal that continued to cling to his name. The twins were enrolled in schools distant from Thornford, where the family name meant nothing and the history of their relations could remain unknown. Thornfield Manor was sold to an American businessman who had no connection to the village and no interest in its history. The house that had witnessed 3 women's convergence toward crime was transformed into something anonymous and impersonal. Eleanor served 6 years of her 12-year sentence before her health deteriorated significantly. She was released on grounds of compassionate consideration, and she spent her remaining years living quietly in a small cottage on the outskirts of Bath, under an assumed name, slowly fading from the notice of anyone who might have recognized her. Catherine, upon her release, emigrated to Australia. By most accounts, she eventually married again and lived a life of quiet respectability, though those who knew her later suggested that she carried always a kind of distance in her eyes, as though she were perpetually observing herself from outside her own existence, never quite fully present. And Margaret lived, as her letter suggested, somewhere on the continent, building a life from the fragments of her former self, attempting daily to reconcile the person she had become with the person she might have been had Thornfield Manor never existed. As for Miss Marple herself, she returned to her cottage in St. Mary Mead and resumed her quiet life of observation and knitting. The grey scarf, finally completed after more than a year of work, was donated to the church's charity auction. She began a new project, Green Shore this time. Something softer than the mysteries she had recently encountered. Something meant to warm rather than to clarify in her final years. Miss Marple occasionally thought about the poisoned Christmas pudding and the 3 women who had independently poisoned it. She thought about the randomness of Robert's death, the way that 3 separate criminal acts had converged to produce an outcome that none of the perpetrators had fully intended. She thought about how mystery, once solved, often raised more questions than it answered, and how the revelation of truth could sometimes do far more damage than the concealment of secrets ever could. But most of all, she thought about the terrible human capacity to justify terrible actions, the way that desperation and fear and wounded pride could transform ordinary people into criminals, and the way that understanding those transformations did not require condoning them, but rather suggested that justice itself needed to be far more complicated, far more humane, and far more willing to acknowledge the circumstances that drove people toward crimes they themselves recognized as wrong. The case of the poisoned Christmas pudding was officially closed. Eleanor had been convicted and imprisoned. Catherine had been convicted and imprisoned. Robert was dead, and the village of Thornford, after its year of scandal and revelation, gradually returned to its customary rhythms, its surface calm, obscuring depths of knowledge that could never be unknowingly ignored again. This was the truth that Miss Marple carried with her as she entered her final years, that mysteries, once solved, did not bring peace, but rather a deeper understanding of how fragile the barriers were between the respectable and the criminal, between love and destruction, between justice and tragedy. And in that understanding lay neither triumph nor despair, but rather the hard-won wisdom that comes only from a lifetime of careful observation of human nature in all its terrible, understandable, inexcusable complexity.